All right, good afternoon, folks, and welcome to another exciting episode of Live with Jimmy from Brooklyn. Jimmy, buddy, how are you today?
Okay, doing fine, boy. We are certainly living in interesting times.
Yeah, you got that right. So, you got a big show for us today?
Yes, I'd like to just not repeat anything I did, but just a slight rehash to make sure people have a little bit of the background. Then I want to really get into some of the documents that Israel captured when they invaded Lebanon in 1983, I believe it was, showing the Soviet and world communist connection to radical Islam. So it's not Marxist Islamist connection, it is communist Muslim connection. This is why for 42 years on the radio, I've been talking about Islamo-Leninism and the Soviet hand in the Muslim glove. Now it's all coming to a head. It should be easy to see, but I still don't think the public really grasps it yet. So hopefully we'll enlighten them a little bit more today. And spread the word, people. Whatever you hear here, spread the word.
Yeah. So, it's your show, Jimmy. Let them have it.
Okay, just want to remind people that the Soviets and the American Communist Party pushed the strategies of Antonio Gramsci. And Gramsci's strategies here, let me just read you from the communist press about Gramsci. They refer to us as the bourgeois society. So here's what the communists write. The ideological erosion of the bourgeois order at every level, economic, political, cultural, social, would precede the initiation of direct frontal assaults on the state. So the Soviets and the American communists and the communists all around the world promote the strategies of Antonio Gramsci. So you have a communist party in every country. All the communist parties are connected. The communists write that, they say that, they're all working together. So they're working globally and locally within every country. So when the American Communist Party had a meeting in 1996, this is it, reports from the 26th National Convention, Communist Party USA. So when the Communist Party had their meeting, they had congratulations and greetings sent to them from 47 different communist parties around the world. Okay? It's a world communist movement all working together. The main communist party in charge is the Soviet, now of course the Communist Chinese Communist Party, and then the very next one is the American Communist Party. Very powerful, influencing on all levels, on all sides. So that's the world communist movement. And I talked about the working among the youth. So I read you from a communist publication, the Young Communist League in America. They do fake collapses, the communists do. They do fake splits. The Russia-China split was fake. That's all been settled officially in 1986 by Gorbachev. And the Young Communist League in America went through 4 changes where they changed the name, but didn't change anything but the name. So as a snake sheds its skin and still remains a snake, the communists write, the Soviets and the communists write about working on the youth, because the youth is the future of the world. So if you get the youth screwed up like in America, they grow up to be screwed up adults, and we're in trouble. So it's a world communist movement. They're working among the youth. They're using Gramsci strategies. At a World Marxist Scholars Conference in America, the communists said they want Jesse Jackson to be the #1 Democrat. He, of course, paved the way for Obama, who had very strong communist connections. One of the communists who spoke at the World Marxist Scholars Conference in America was Ron Daniels, and he works with a communist group called the Center for Constitutional Rights. So this American communist said, we need ballots and bullets to bring about the new world order. So without going in more details on that, now, 10th anniversary, communist victory in Vietnam, the communists celebrated in New York at the Washington Irving High School, and the main speaker was Jesse Jackson. Now, so you have I gave you 1996, the communist meeting in America, and how the world communists sent greetings. In 2005, American Communist Party publication, The Road to Socialism USA, and it describes all the groups they're working in America. So they work globally, but then each communist party in every country works locally. Every area, every city, every ethnic, racial, every group in every country is targeted in every country, and this is going on in every country. So this is a massive world communist movement. So I'm not going to read all of it here, but The Road to Socialism, American Communist Party, 2005, they list the groups, and I'm not going to read them. There's too many. Let me see. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. There's 30 different groups in America they're working in. They're working along the Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Indian Americans, immigrants, Arabs and Middle East people, farmers, rural population, women, youth, the national and racially oppressed. They're working with seniors. They're working with Jews and anti-Semitism, progressive culture, healthcare, so all the religions. So they divide every country into segments, racially, sexually, culturally, every level. This is all around the world. And then they all pull it together. It's the world communist movement. It's enormous power. And for people who don't believe that the Soviets were in charge of all of this, here's what the communists write. American Communist Party. This is from Gus Hall. Gus Hall was the head of the Communist Party for many, many years, and he had said something like he wants to strangle all the congressmen with the guts of the senators. So this guy is extremely militant, violent, pro-communist. He's a Communist Party leader. And when he was the American Communist Party leader, Gus Hall ran for president, and one of his big supporters was a man named John Brennan. John Brennan, of course, ended up heading the CIA, and John Brennan was a key person in the communist movement to topple Trump, claiming Trump was working with the Soviets or Russia. So here's what Gus Hall said, head of the American Communist Party. There's no way anyone can unlink the Soviet Union or other socialist countries from the world revolutionary process. The Reagan administration will have to learn that the key indestructible link of world reality is the relationship between the Soviet Union and the world revolutionary process. So they admit it's a world movement. They work in every level, in every country, and people ignore this. They also talk about getting control of the media, a new world information order they were pushing. Here's one of the things from the Soviet press. They write about the growing role of the mass and propaganda media. They write about the growing role of the mass and propaganda media in promoting the party's economic strategy, its social policy, and in cultivating the socialist consciousness. It regards television, radio, and the press as powerful vehicles of publicity and instruments of public control. We must use the mighty ideological potential of television more effectively and heighten the impact of the entire propaganda and information complex. Now, the conservatives have tried to counter this, expose it, and counter it. Really had no impact, but of course Trump just started pointing at the media and calling them fake news. Trump did more with those two words than we did with decades trying to expose the communist influence in the media. Now, in Gorbachev's writing, this is the guy that America embraced. He was the guy that was going to make peace in the world, sort of like Hitler made peace with Neville Chamberlain, and of course Chamberlain got fooled. And then Gorbachev did the same thing. So he did peace in our time with Reagan the same way Hitler did peace in our time with Neville Chamberlain of England. So here's what the Soviets say. This is 1986. This is under Gorbachev. This is a Soviet publication, adopting a bold, realistic, mobilizing, and inspiring strategy, one that is Leninist in spirit in the struggle for the triumph of communist ideals of peace and progress. The 27th Congress of the Communist Party Soviet Union expresses the party's firm determination to honorably follow our great road and open up new vistas for the creative energy and revolutionary initiative of the working class. And it goes on to praise, of course, Lenin Now, Lenin did a fake collapse, or at least an imminent collapse. When Lenin and the communists first took over Russia, there was opposition to the communists. So they started having problems. So what Lenin did, he faked that there was a massive movement against the communists. He even let battles happen. He let anti-communists escape or be help it break out of prisons. So Lenin was able to create the illusion that the communist takeover was not consolidated and it was looked like it was failing. So he lured in business people, and they invested, figuring they're going to get in at the ground floor and be able to do business with the Russians, after the communist collapse. Of course, the communists didn't collapse. The Russians, the Soviets, then rounded up all the intelligence agencies that came into the country to help the counter-revolutionaries and killed them all. And he kept all the money that was invested. And one of the main guys that went into Russia invested money. They allowed one guy to become rich. That was Armand Hammer. Armand Hammer was a multi-millionaire business industrialist, and he was basically a Soviet agent. Okay, so I gave a little bit of the background, and one last thing on the background. The communists admit that they support terrorism, but they don't support terrorism if it hurts the communist movement to build a mass movement. In other words, the communists are working on masses of people, again, kids, elderly, women, youth, minorities, Puerto Ricans, blacks. Communists are working in every group to try to pull them into the communist movement by helping each group with their most immediate needs and solving those needs. And then they go on to the next need. At the same time, they're indoctrinating every group I mentioned. There are 47 different groups, indoctrinating them that you're only really going to have true peace, freedom, and justice and harmony under a socialist system. So it's a process. The communists describe it as a process. So if a communist does an act of terror that's attributed to the communist, that will hurt the growing communist influence among the masses. So the communists don't support individual acts of terrorism, communist terrorism. Of course, they support Muslim terrorism and other terrorism. They will incite and even help so-called right-wing terrorism, because that doesn't hurt the communist movement. Any so-called right-wing terrorism helps the communist movement because it discredits the right. But let me explain now. This I have to read again. This is the Communist Press, and this is a publication, Terrorism, Is It Revolutionary, with a question mark. This is the communist publication. So, this is what the communists write. Terrorism, is it justified as a tactic or not? To arrive at a sound answer to this question requires discarding at the outset any abstract moral considerations. When we see what our ruling class is doing in Vietnam and the ocean of blood flowing there, when we think of the centuries-old oppression, misery, and sorrow heaped upon the racial minorities in our land, when we remember the oppressive role of the United States imperialism in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and the rest of the world, surely any measure that would hasten the end of this damnable system would be humane and moral, for no amount of violence needed for ending it could compare in magnitude to that employed to keep it alive. So basically, they're admitting they support terrorism unless it hurts the communist growing influence. So they support terrorism, they support anything to bring down this system. So when I tell people the Soviets set up the drug operations against America in the early 50s, following what the Chinese communists already had going in the late 40s. So the communists are behind this drug plague that's destroying America and in fact the entire world. And the communists not only do this to destroy mostly American youth, you destroy the youth, you take people out potentially of being in the military. So you're actually defeating a military before these people are even in the military. You're getting them when they're young, addicted, and destroyed through drugs. That causes societal, cultural, economic, and political chaos and downfall, which was the written strategy of Gramsci, social, cultural, political, economic. So the drug plague does that. So they support terrorism, they support the drugs, they support the human trafficking, the sexual trafficking, anything that destroys the targeted country is legal and moral to the communist. It's called revolutionary morality. Just like when the communists, the liberals, the fake media, when they lie and do face reporting and do propaganda, that's called revolutionary truth. Anything that helps the revolution is moral and just. That's the communist belief. So that is a brief background, and you could go to my previous lectures or presentations here on rumble.com or KLW News. I'm Jimmy from Brooklyn. Also, you could go to, I did JRNYQUIST, jrnyquist.blog. I did about 20 interviews there, an hour each, where I laid this out. So the people that are listening have to spread the word and have to learn this. Now, in another statement of 81 Communist and Workers' Party, this is from Moscow, 1960. This is from the American Communist Party. They describe peaceful coexistence. So the Soviets write, they don't export revolution. That sounds good. They don't export revolution. But then they go on a couple of paragraphs later and they write that it is our moral duty as communists and internationalists to help any movement anywhere that's fighting for peace, justice, and socialism. So the liberals will say, the communists say they don't export revolution, but the communists do, because they work through the communist parties in every country. Lenin's party of a new type. Every member of the Communist Party is to go out and penetrate and influence existing groups or create new groups. The idea is mass influence. So in America, mass influence, they work among Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, Asian Americans, every group, women, youth, every political group, all the unions, all the schools, all the media. So I covered how they work to get control or influence of the youth. I covered how they work in the unions, they work in the religions, they work at every level. It's in every single country worldwide. It's the world communist movement. So they use different strategies. Now, peaceful coexistence later on was called détente. So Nixon was a certifiable anti-communist. Nixon warned President Eisenhower that Castro was a communist, but nobody was thinking that. Nixon also embraced the communist defector Whittaker Chambers and others. So the communists knew Nixon was against them. So when Nixon ran against John Kennedy for president, the communists, of course, with their underground abilities, with their massive influence all over the place, the communists worked to help Kennedy get elected. So the anti-communist Nixon lost that election for president. John Kennedy won. But John Kennedy made a speech in Berlin denouncing the Berlin Wall and denouncing communism. And it was under Kennedy that he unleashed what was already planned before Kennedy became president, the invasion to liberate Cuba from communism. So the communists worked to get Kennedy elected versus Nixon, and then later on, the communists killed Kennedy. This is how they work. Now, we hear in America how President Kennedy had his confrontation with the Soviets, and the Soviets backed down and Kennedy won. Well, that's nice to believe. It's nice to believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, but what's the reality? The communist goal was to keep Cuba communist. So whatever they did, whatever we think Kennedy did, whatever success the propagandists, the conservatives, whoever says that we defeated the Soviets over Cuba, no. The communists won. Cuba stayed communist. And Castro's Cuba was key to spreading communism all throughout Latin America. Communist Cuba had a strong influence in America along with the Communist Party in every group, the blacks, Hispanics, the women, the gays. It's absolutely amazing how this works. So when our side has a loss, they don't even see it. So you have the defeat of communism hoax, where they outsmarted the Republicans and the conservatives. You have the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Soviets backing down from President Kennedy. That was a hoax. Defeat of communism hoax is the biggest threat because, as I showed you before, the communists are worldwide. The communists admit the Soviets were the leaders of it. Now, of course, it's between the Soviets and the communist Chinese. So among the conservatives now, we hear this crazy idea that we could sort of pull Russia out of China's arms. I hope that's true. I doubt it. People who say this don't really understand the communist history or the idea of the Lenin's party of a new type. This is why why President Trump might be making mistakes here and there, because he doesn't have a background and knowledge of communism. He knows they're bad, so his instincts about them are pretty good, but he doesn't know the reality, and there's nobody around President Trump that I think there's nobody around President Trump that really understands the communist movement and the communist history. So with that background, let me get here to the main thing I wanted to get to today, and now here it is. Okay. I wanted to talk about the communist involvement with the terror movement and some documents. When Israel invaded Lebanon, I believe it was 1983, Israel captured a lot of documents in Lebanon, and the revelations here are fascinating. I don't know how much of this came out at the time because I have a publication here. Okay, so this is from 1982, so obviously they invaded Lebanon before, because this publication exposing it is the Review of the News, August 11, 1982. Volume 18, number 32. And this is put out by Congressman Larry McDonald. Larry McDonald was a congressman. I believe he was a Democrat. Congressman Larry McDonald was a congressman from Georgia. He was also the head of the John Birch Society, an anti-communist group that's trying to stop communism, globalism, the UN, and all of these various threats. So the communists have to destroy the Birch Society. So like what all the communists do, anybody in the way of communism is called a fascist. They're called racist. They're called anti-Semitic. That's the communist line. Anybody in their way, that's the main charges. So the Soviets were so upset about having an actual anti-communist in our government, and they were so terrified that he might build awareness and help build and enlighten and inform and build a communist, an understanding of the communist threat. So the Soviets could not stand for this. So the communists murdered Congressman Larry McDonald, but they shot down his plane. Okay, so they shot down his plane over the Sakhalin Islands. I think that was flight number 007. So the Soviets murdered Congressman McDonald. The Soviets tried to murder the Polish Pope, who was anti-communist. The Soviets sent assassins to shoot John Wayne, the actor, because John Wayne was an outspoken anti-communist. John Wayne did anti-communist movies, and John Wayne was the head of the Screen Actors Guild. The communists always try to get influence. So the Soviets and Hitler, both socialists, the Soviets and Hitler both said whoever controls Hollywood controls the world. So just as the communists talk about building a bigger, stronger information and propaganda complex, John Wayne was in the way of that, so they tried to kill him. The assassins got caught. I believe they got convicted, but then they started working with us against communism. That's a part of history very few people know. Okay, so let me get here now. Again, this is Review of the News, 1982. The title of this article is Moscow's Man, Arafat, and the PLO. Let me just read here a little bit. This is the article about the documents. Crushed in battle in Lebanon, the Palestinian Liberation Organization is planning a long-term political offensive in the United States. On July 9, the PLO commenced a secret 3-day meeting in London to coordinate a covert political action offensive aimed at changing U.S. and foreign policy towards Israel. Okay, now look at the results here decades later. Look at all the people denouncing Israel, blaming Israel for our war against Iran. Our war against Iran is not we attacked Iran, this is our war against Iran. It's actually, finally, a counterattack, a counter-offensive to a country who's been killing Americans and people all over the world. So they're saying here they want to counter and change the political opinion of people toward Israel. So this is being written here in the 1980s or so. It says, reports state that among those attending the meeting were Columbia University professor Edward Said, a member of the Palestinian National Council and the PLO's debating arm, and Dr. Walid al-Khalidi. Now, these are people who work in America. Edward Said is quoted a lot in the communist publications here, the communist front groups. It says the PLO group decided that since the U.S. holds most of the cards regarding Israel and the Lebanese crisis, all efforts must be concentrated in the United States in order to change the U.S. stand on the Palestinian problem. I'm going to skip through it here. It says now this article here, again, about the communist documents. This paragraph, this section is titled "A Meeting in Moscow." In mid-June, during meetings at the White House, Israeli Prime Minister Begin presented President Reagan with a large package of captured PLO documents demonstrating pervasive and direct Soviet support for the PLO. Copies of many of these documents have been obtained by the Review of the News, that's his publication, both in the original Arabic and English translation. Among the most interesting is the PLO summary of a meeting between a 9-member PLO delegation led by Yasser Arafat and top Soviet leaders in the Kremlin on November 13, 1979. In addition to Arafat, who used the code name Abu Anwar, the PLO delegates were leading representatives of the main PLO terrorist groups. It goes on with a lot of names here. Names don't matter. But one of the groups that met was the Marxist-Leninist Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Now, most of the Muslim terror groups think they're fighting for Allah, so their God is telling them to do this. The Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine is not an Islamic terror group, it's a Muslim terror group, and they are Marxist-Leninist, so they don't do suicide bombings. This Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine describes themselves as a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary group. So you see, you have Marxist-Leninist Muslims, and then you have Islamists who think they're fighting for God, but behind it all is the Soviets pushing it. So when Karl Marx and others said we have to destroy religion, Lenin was a lot smarter than Marx. That's why I'm saying this is not Marxism, it's communism. Marx wanted to destroy religion. Lenin said, no, don't destroy religion, get control of it. Because if you get people thinking they're dying for God, you get people think they're dying for Allah, it's hard to defeat them because they don't fear death. In fact, some of them want to die. That's a tough enemy to be fighting, like the Japanese in World War II. They thought they were fighting for God. They thought their emperor was God. So they're able to do their own suicide bombings, the kamikaze. And look how hard that was. And because of the fear of that, in World War II, we knew if we invaded Japan, America would have 1 million casualties. That's why we dropped the atom bomb. It actually saved lives, as horrible as that sounds. Dropping that atom bomb saved a lot of lives on both sides. Okay, so it goes on here. The PLO Executive Committee representatives of the Democratic Front for Liberation of Palestine. It mentions the name. I'm not going to read the names. Forgive me for that. Some of these names are hard to pronounce, and it really doesn't matter here. But it goes on here, all these different liberation movements. The 3 Soviet officials were Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, Boris Pomarev, and Oleg Alexeyev Grinevsky. They were listed in PL papers as head of the Middle East Department in the Soviet Foreign Ministry. Okay, the Middle East Department. Now, in America, we have the communist movement here. So in the Soviet Union, you have the Soviet Academy of Sciences. So Academy of Sciences, we usually think of science as high-level math, technical stuff, computers, chips. You know, we think of things like this, chemistry. But to a communist, science is Marxism. Science is Marxism. Marxism is science. Marxism and revolution are an art. So the best brains in the Soviet Union are in the Soviet Academy of Sciences. Within the Soviet Academy of Sciences, you have the Institute for the Study of the USA and Canada. Now, that group studies America. They know our history, our culture. They know everything about us. They have committees. They have professors in the universities. So the Soviets developed strategy and tactics at the Institute for the Study of USA and Canada. That gets sent down to the KGB front group in Washington, the Institute for Policy Studies, and then that filters down to the liberal media, through the colleges and universities. So when the communists target American youth, when the communists target the blacks, the Hispanics, the Asians, they do it at all levels, through the schools, through the universities. So here now, dealing with the Middle East, it's called, I just read it here, the Middle East Department in the Soviet Foreign Ministry. Our files, however, reflect that Gronevsky had been a negotiator at the European Nuclear Disarmament Conference during 1966 and 68. He's a member of the SALT I negotiating team from 1969 to 1972. He was the head deputy chief of Near Eastern Countries Department of the USSR Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It gives the whole history of this guy. Part of Arafat's report to this gathering on 1979 non-aligned conference in Havana. Okay, the non-aligned movement, now that sounds like neutral countries. They're non-aligned. They're not aligned with the West or with the communists. However, the Soviets are leading it, and they're meeting in Havana. Okay, so how non-aligned are they? So part of Arafat's report to the gathering of the 1979 non-aligned conference in Havana outlined the behind-the-scenes political support and advice supplied by the Cuban government and Fidel Castro. Arafat also provided insight on the role of Ramsey Clark and his visit to the PLO-controlled areas of Lebanon. Ramsey Clark was Attorney General of the United States. I believe it was under Carter. Ramsey Clark worked with Bill Kunstler in a group called International Action Center, which is on Manhattan in New York, 14th Street, 39. Now, I forget if it's east or west 14th Street, but it's 39, 14th Street, either east or west, I forget. International Action Center. So Ramsey Clark was an enemy agent in our government, and once he's out of government, he kept working with the communists. So here he's meeting with Castro's people and Arafat. The minutes read as follows. Arafat, I have the testimony of Ramsey Clark. After his visit to our region, Clark returned to the U.S. and convened a press conference. He said that what happened to the PLO in Lebanon was a crime. Okay, so Ramsey Clark, an enemy agent in our government, is saying that what happened to the PLO in Lebanon was a crime. So fighting against communism, fighting against terrorism is a crime to a communist. But the crime of terrorism is legal and moral if it helps bring down the West. So you see how the communists work? And by the way, I mentioned Bill Kunstler. Bill Kunstler had said blacks cannot be racist because they have no power. So they have no power. That's amazing. In New York, when the radical left guy was mayor, Lindsay, in New York we had like 2,400 murders a year. And it was mostly people of color. So when communists like Ramsey Clark or Bill Kunstler says the blacks have no power, he was meaning maybe political power. But also the communists teach power comes out of the barrel of a gun. So if you indoctrinate blacks that they're victims of oppression and racism and there's no hope, you have to get out of the street and into the revolution. There are better things to fight and die for. That last statement I said comes from the Revolutionary Communist Party just about 4 years ago. You have to get out of the street into the revolution. So when the communists, when the Maoists preach that power comes out of the barrel of gun, and you indoctrinate and brainwash people, they have absolutely no power. Well, then power comes out of the barrel of a gun. Now, that was mostly crime and maybe rival gangs killing each other at that time, but the communists are working in prisons and street gangs, and they're working to coordinate them, and they write, basically they're saying, quit killing each other, not to quit killing each other and get into the revolution. So there's this growing movement again. The communists are working with the youth, they're working among all minorities. So you see how all these would look like separate pieces when you put them together. How this is an immense, it's like a tidal wave coming at you from all different directions at the same time as a tornado and an earthquake. So it goes on here, Ramsey Clark visit The minutes read as follows. Arafat, I have the testimony of Ramsey Clark. Clark returned to the U.S., convened a press conference that what happened to the PLO in Lebanon was a crime. Later in this Kremlin meeting, terrorist leader Arafat said of the Iran hostage crisis, the Americans of the Carter administration contacted us through some Arab states and others. Gromyko asked. Gromyko asked. This is what Gromyko asked. I'm sorry. Did the Americans contact you on their own initiative? Arafat replied, not us directly, but through Ramsey Clark, who is one of our sympathizers. So Arafat, who's a Soviet agent, head of some of the Muslim terror groups, the PLO, Arafat referred to Ramsey Clark as one of our sympathizers. It goes on here. The PLO's minutes of this Kremlin meeting contain long speeches by Pomeranov and Gromyko to Arafat detailing the political maneuvers and lines the Soviets wanted the PLO to undertake in manipulating various Arab governments, particularly the Saudi royal family, to thwart America's influence. So the Soviets were trying to break Saudi Arabia from being sort of friendly to the West. So the Soviets do operations to make a split between Saudi Arabia and America. The 9/11 attack, a lot of the people involved in the 9/11 attack on the Trade Center from Saudi Arabia. Now, there's no way to know this, no way to prove it. I believe they were Saudis, but I also believe they were influenced by the communists. The communists work to influence all sides. They influence the right wing to do terror, so then we discredit the right. And then if we discredit the right, that helps the left. So that's how the communists work. So anyway, it goes on here. Gromyko assured Arafat, we will back every proposal and every plan which you submit to the UN. The support for it also applies to our socialist comrades. Okay? So they're going to submit this report and proposal to the United Nations. And the support for it also applies to our socialist comrades. Okay, now remember that. It also applies to the socialist comrades. When Gus Hall wrote, there's no way anyone can unlink the Soviet Union and the socialist countries from the world revolutionary process, okay? Part of the world revolutionary process is terrorism, particularly the Muslim terrorism. So here, this is being admitted now by the communists, that they're going to work through the UN, and it also has the support of the socialist comrades. It goes on here. Pomerov, whose international department is responsible for coordinating Soviet covert action implemented through the non-ruling communist parties. Okay? This is amazing. So the International Department of the Soviet Union is responsible for coordinating covert action. So the Soviets admit to doing covert action implemented through non-ruling communist parties, international fronts, and those sections of the KGB that carry out such missions through agents of influence. Okay, so communist parties, non-ruling communist parties. So you have the communist parties in the communist countries supporting this, and then you have communist parties in all the countries who are non-ruling. In other words, they're not in charge. So all the communist parties worldwide are working on this. They're working with international fronts. Now, international fronts in America would be the tax-exempt KGB front group in Washington, Institute for Policy Studies. It would be the World Peace Council, the World Council of Churches, and the World Health Organizations. That's all part of the international communist movement. And here the communists are actually openly talking or writing about implemented through non-ruling communist parties. That's the French Communist Party, American Communist Party, Italy's Communist Party, Israeli Communist Party, and international fronts. That's the Soviet American Friendship Committee. That's the World Peace Council. It's the Institute for Policy Studies. International fronts and those sections of the KGB that carry out such missions through agents of influence urged the PLO closely to coordinate their UN activity with Moscow. Said one of the Soviet leaders, Pomeranov, it is very important for us to know in advance how to exploit the UN staged by exposing aggressive actions which Israel conducts in South Lebanon. So the communists set up the United Nations for world government. So at the UN, you have people pushing world government. It was set up by communists for world government. The UN celebrates Soviet holidays. As far as I know, the UN never ever celebrated the 4th of July. The UN had terror states, and Cuba had rotating leadership of like the Human Rights Council. Now, how could China be involved in the Human Rights Council when they're taking away the human rights and even lives of Muslim Chinese and Christian Chinese and flooding us with heroin and fentanyl? How could China ever be in the UN when UN was supposed to be composed or comprised of peace-loving nations? Well, the communists fight for peace. Peace is what you get after communist victory. So most people think of peace as the end of hostilities where people are living relatively free and happy. To a communist, peace is only achieved when the communist forces are victorious. That's why the communists mounted the peace offenses during the Vietnam War, was to stop us from fighting back. And then when we basically surrendered in Vietnam and lost Vietnam, the communists celebrate their victory in Vietnam. They call it the celebration of the peace of Vietnam. And the symbol of the peace movement was the two fingers up in the shape of V for victory. People have to understand the communists work on all sides. They work through the UN. Now, this report here that I'm reading got to the broader public by Congressman Larry McDonald. Larry McDonald was the head of a group fighting against communism. And that group fighting against communism, the John Birch Society, is also fighting against the UN and the globalists. So the communists were against Congressman McDonald for exposing it, and they were against the Birch Society for exposing it. So the communists, like I said, they accused Trump of being a fascist. Anybody who's in the way, anyway, anyhow, no matter where, what, away, why, where, whatever, anybody who stands in the way of communism is usually called the fascist. The communists took over Cuba, claiming they're fighting fascism. The communists took over Nicaragua, claiming they're fighting fascism. The communists took over South Africa, fighting against racism. The communists claim they fight against anti-Semitism and they fight against racism. That gives them cover, because how could you oppose somebody fighting against anti-Semitism and against racism? That's how the communists work. So it goes on here. They have to exploit the UN. Now they got something again, this guy Paranimov. Statement to the PLO leaders on the use of civilian casualties should serve as a caution to all in view of PLO's propaganda on civilian losses in southern Lebanon. It is a theme to which we will return later in this article. Okay, so the congressman describing how the communists work and the terrorists work, they're going to use the issue of civilian casualties. This is why the enemy, whether it's Muslims or communists, they will put their weapons or their leadership near a school, a church, or mosque, or a hospital. This way, if you shoot at the enemy, you're going to have civilian casualties, and then the media plays that up. This is how they work, because then we're the enemy. So this antagonizes the enemy against us more, and then it antagonizes peace-loving people in our country who may be on the left, but not the enemy. So now they're building a big movement here that we're killing people in Gaza, Israel, and America. We're killing people in Iran. In other words, the enemy could build nuclear weapons and aim it at us. The left in this country doesn't oppose that. The left opposes our nuclear weapons. The left opposes us fighting. You never saw massive riots in the street against what the communists are doing, but you see massive riots in the street by communists against people who are trying to stop what's going on. This is why the communists in this country have this movement against MAGA, the movement against the police, the movement against ICE, the movement against our military. For decades, the communists were saying they're working among the poor, the blacks, Hispanics, everybody, working against poverty. And they say we're wasting money on the military weapons. We have to cut out the military budget and spend that money on the needs of the people. So after we supposedly defeated communism, we quit building weapons. We closed down a lot of our factories. Now the communists, right, because Putin is in charge, the communists are behind the terrorist movement. So Iran is a terrorist state. Iran, according to the communist press, the Iranian government under the Shah, a Shah was like a king, okay? Iran was basically fairly free and moderate. It was stabilizing. It was, like I said, the only harshness was maybe Iranian intelligence countering KGB operations and penetration of Soviet agents. So the Communist Party in Lebanon, in Iran, gets credit for toppling the Shah. So again, Communist Party of a new type working in all countries. The communists in Iran and around the world mounted a big campaign against the Shah. So stabilized pro-West Iran was toppled, and then you get a radical Muslim terror leadership. But the Muslim leaders were trained by the Soviets. The Soviets toppled the Shah, so the whole thing was a Soviet operation. Iran could not have done anything without Soviet, or what we say today, Russian approval. So on Putin's birthday, they attacked Israel. The Muslim terrorists attacked Israel. Now, they did it in such a way they wanted to provoke a major counterattack. When you invade a country that you're at peace with, when you invade a country and you go out of your way to do the most tragic, atrocious terrorist, you cut off babies' heads, you rape women, you might have raped the babies too, these people. They wanted a response. Now, the communist leaders decades ago from the Weather Underground terrorist group, who Obama was quite close to, one of their leaders had said, it's not the action, it's the reaction. In other words, the communists do an action to provoke a reaction. Now, what happened in Gaza, you had the reaction, but then it's the reaction to that reaction. It's like a snowball effect. It's like dropping a rock off a cliff and it creates an avalanche. So they went out of their way, the terrorists, when they attacked Israel, they went out of their way to cause a reaction, and the reaction was big. Now that big reaction created a bigger counter-reaction. So now you got this massive movement to hate and destroy Israel and to hate and destroy America. You saw how the communists were able to get people out in the streets in America, in every city, rioting after Floyd died of an overdose, and they blamed it on the cop. You see how the Communist Party of a new type influenced mass moods, mass trends, mass thought patterns. There was no anti-Trump movement until he became president. What the Republicans call, and they laugh at it, they call it TDS, Trump Derangement Syndrome, like it's funny. It's not funny. There was no Trump Derangement Syndrome until he got in the way of the communist movement. So there was no mass movement against Trump until he got into the government and exposed the media, the propaganda from the anti-American mainstream media. Trump got in the way of the communist movement on some levels, so the communists had to destroy him. And being able to change mass moods, mass thought patterns, and mass trends, the communists created what they call now, what the conservatives call now, the Trump Derangement Syndrome. Everything the communists do makes perfect sense. It's perfectly logical. Not to our minds. The communist mind is different. Anything and everything that helps the revolution is moral and just. It doesn't matter if little children are put into sex bondage and slavery. It doesn't matter if you're destroying families' lives through the torturous drug addiction, the total chaos and downfall of a society through destroying and disrupting the families and everything. That's all moral and just, because the end result is going to be peace, love, harmony, and socialism. The communists, it's like a satanic religion, and they have human sacrifices. This is absolutely amazing. It's the hard left that's the most fanatical supporting abortion in America. You could have conservative people who support abortion, but the most radical hard left are fanatical pro-abortion, and they're fanatical about allowing suicide. So they promote abortion of babies, and they promote the death of the elderly. Now, there's a slippery slope. If you push and support killing at the beginning of life, and you push and support killing at the end of life, the slippery slope eventually reaches all of us in the middle. And being that the communist movement murdered up to 150 million people, they have no qualms about killing people. So this movement that murdered 150 million people works for peace in countries they're working to topple. So as they're in your country killing you with drugs, fentanyl, COVID, whatever operations the communists do to kill us, at the same time they're killing us that way, they're killing us with making a peace movement, trying to restrain us from fighting back. Because the communists love the police and the military in Cuba, in Russia, in China, in Iran. When you see that over one third of the Jewish vote went to Mandami, now that sounds ridiculous, but the communists are very powerful. There's no way people voted for Mandami not knowing what he is. Now, I have Muslim friends, sort of friends, and some of them voted for Mandami. Now, the people I know, I don't think they're terrorists. I don't think they're communist. I know them somewhat where I don't think that, but they may have voted for Mandami, one Muslim to another. It's like in New York, we may have had good Christian Italians who voted for Mario Cuomo, the father of this last Governor Cuomo. Mario Cuomo was an old-fashioned liberal. I don't think he was anti-American, but he was liberal. He was on the left. But there was a time you could be on the left and still be anti-communist. We had Mayor Koch, a Jewish guy, mayor of New York. He was definitely on the left, definitely a liberal. But when he knew a communist, he was against it. Now, he may not have understood it. So the same way Italians vote for a creep like Cuomo, including this last governor, maybe Muslims voted for Mandami, Muslim to Muslim. But Mandami is not your peaceful Muslim. Mandami is supported by terrorist groups. One of the groups that supports him is the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. That's a communist group. They call themselves Marxist Leninist revolutionaries. So let me get back to these documents here. Arafat continued to emphasize the PLO's coordination with key Soviet international fronts, stating, "We maintain coordination with the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Committee and the World Peace Council and the international institutions such as the Democratic Lawyers Association, International Association of Democratic Lawyers, who a while ago held a symposium in Paris and condemned Camp David." So this communist group condemned Camp David, which worked for peace between Muslims and Jews. Now these groups, like the National Lawyers Guild, the Democratic Lawyers Association, the World Peace Council, these are all KGB groups. So the World Peace Council works for peace, meaning that to stop America's military buildup. The World Peace Council says America's military is a threat to world peace. The World Council of Churches says America's military buildup is a sin. And the World Health Organization says America's military is a threat to world health. Those are people from the International Department of the Soviet Union. Goes on here. It should be noted that Ramsey Clark has in recent years been a prominent participant in the International Association of Democratic Lawyers activities. Now, democratic and democracy mean different things. To us, democratic means you have elections, we have a constitution, we're pretty fair, we have separation of powers, we have court systems, you have the defense, you have the prosecution. You know, basically, like what we live is a democracy. We're technically a republic. But to a communist, what they write, democracy is ruled by the people, and the people are represented by their communist party. So we make a peace treaty with the enemy, but we don't agree with the word peace is. We think peace is the end of hostilities, where people live in basically fair, even, equal, everything is okay. To the communists, you only have peace once communist forces are victorious. So when we sign a peace treaty with the Soviets, that treaty, if the Soviets sign it, that treaty is meant to help the Soviets. Doesn't matter what we think or want. When they sign a peace treaty, because to them, peace is communist victory. So when they talk about democracy, they're talking about communism. So when the communists write, that when they're in charge in America, we're still going to have the separation of powers. We're still going to have the justice system, the Justice Department, free elections. We're still going to have the government, all that, everything, all the good stuff. But they'll have class content, meaning the working class versus the capitalist ruling class, meaning communism. So when you have a Justice Department that targets Trump, when you have local DAs put in by a communist named George Soros, we're still going to have the justice system, we're still going to have judges, district attorneys, but they'll have class content. In other words, they'll be weaponized to make a communist victory. Now that is following when the Soviets, right, they're going to use Czechoslovakia 1948 as the model. What the communists did in Czechoslovakia, they had a coalition government. You had communists in the government and non-communists. Maybe even in there somewhere a couple of anti-communists in the Czechoslovak government. The communists got control of the enforcement parts of the government, and they built mass popular front groups, militant groups at the bottom. Jesse Jackson refers to that bottom stuff as street heat. That's like the Floyd riots in America. That's the groups at the bottom. That's the popular groups at the bottom, the street crowd. Jesse Jackson referred to that as street heat. So in Czechoslovakia, they waged war on the non-communists and anti-communists in the Czechoslovak government. So they squeezed out the moderates, they squeezed out the non-communists and anti-communists. So Czechoslovakia became communist without firing a shot. Now, they did throw the prime minister out the window, but there was no shooting. I mean, the communists may have shot and killed people, but there was no armed opposition stopping the communists. So that was a successful communist revolution without firing a shot. Now, Sun Tzu, 2,500 years ago, wrote that armed conflict is the most primitive form of warfare, meaning there's other ways to win and fight without warfare. Back then, warfare was shooting arrows, throwing rocks, throwing spears, catapulting stones over the wall, maybe a dead, diseased animal over the wall, or a ball of fire over the wall, over the fort. So when battle was really primitive, they referred to armed conflict as primitive, meaning there's other ways to battle. So when the communists promote Antonio Gramsci, and they say social, cultural, political, economic, that's the warfare without military or violent means. When the communists write about the peaceful transition to socialism, they're talking about Gramsci, a way to win a war without armed conflict, peaceful, social, cultural, political, economic. They're also talking about Sun Tzu, armed conflict as primitive. So the Soviets, the communists use all of that. At the same time, they build massive weapons. So they're ready at all levels. So they could use the non-violent, peaceful transition to socialism just enough to weaken us, and now we're very weak. And then come with the hammer. And what did the communists write decades ago? They're going to put the decadent capitalists to sleep. We're going to promote the largest peace movement ever. And the decadent capitalists are going to embrace us, and then we're going to crush them, and we're going to put them to sleep, and then we're going to crush them with our clenched fist. Now, I didn't get the quote right now because I didn't read it. That's from memory, so I don't have the exact words, but the point and what they're saying is there. So you combine all these strategies, Sun Tzu, from The Art of War 2,500 years ago, from Antonio Gramsci, from Czechoslovakia 1948. All of that stuff has been successfully implemented, and now we see the end result. There's huge parts of our population. Again, the communists work in the masses. We have huge parts of our population against Israel, against Jews, against America, against Christians, against heterosexuals. They got kids hating their parents, little boys hating their own genitals. We are in such a mess here. The KGB has to be celebrating. They're on the verge of major victory. Trump parachuted into the midst of this mess, and he's trying to hold it back. And now I see conservatives complaining about Trump. He's doing this wrong. He shouldn't have did this. He shouldn't have done that. Look, nobody knows how to handle this. We never had a president. Reagan was really good. He had a really good understanding until the end. At the end, when Reagan was slipping with the beginning of Alzheimer's or dementia, everything collapsed under the guise of peace in our time. That's what Hitler did to Britain with Neville Chamberlain. Now, what Hitler did, how did Neville Chamberlain, England, think we could have peace in our time with Hitler? Well, maybe Neville Chamberlain might not really have believed that. Hitler did a massive deception. Hitler built when I say Hitler, I mean his government, his military, they built like 6 airplanes that flew very fast. And I'm not talking about the jet engines and the rockets later on in the Nazi term, but Hitler built like 6 airplanes that flew very fast, but only for short distances, and they didn't maneuver well. But Hitler knew that the West, England, France, America, they had spies all over the place. There was military attachés that came and met with the Nazis. So Hitler had it where, let's say a couple of Americans were up in an airplane and they're flying across Germany, and all of a sudden this airplane zooms past them real fast. They report back that Germany has these planes that outfly us. We can't match them. Now, they didn't know that these planes were specifically built for deception. The planes flew very fast, extremely fast compared to the usual airplane at the time. But those planes only flew short distances very fast, and they weren't maneuverable. So word got back to Western intelligence that the Nazis have a super fast airplane that could probably outfly our bullets. So Hitler had those airplanes. He had maybe 6 of them. So when the Americans, the French, the British, whoever saw it, definitely the British saw it, the West figured they can't match Hitler. He's got super weapons. So he did have super weapons, but that part of it was fake. And then what Hitler did, he had those airplanes, or ones that looked like them, maybe weren't even flying, but he had those airplanes strategically placed in different airfields with numbers on the side. When you get numbers, long numbers, that implies that he has thousands of these airplanes. So if you're an American or British agent and you think you're collecting intelligence, but the intelligence was planted to fool you. So the Western intelligence believed that Hitler has thousands of these super fast planes. We have nothing like it. We can't fight these people. We need to delay so we have time to build up. So the West figured they can't fight Hitler and they have to start building up. At the same time that's going on, there was a communist movement in America to keep us from building weapons, to keep us out of war, particularly when the Soviets and Nazis were partners. So the Nazis helped a peace movement in America, no war. 20 years earlier, we were in war, no way to fight in Europe again. Basically, F you, Europe. You had a war, World War I, now you're World War II, we're not going into this. So you had Nazis promoting that normal sentiment of the Americans, and then the communists were pushing that too. So it turned out that totally fooled the West. That's why Chamberlain signed that deal with Hitler, thinking this was a peace deal, peace in our time. Now, whether Chamberlain was pro-Nazi, I don't know. Maybe he was. I don't know. But it was deception that did that. The same way the communist deception of embracing peace. They did that same type of operation, not with a weapon, not with a fake superiority of the Air Force. The communist deception under Reagan was similar to that. Chamberlain could have been a good, loyal, patriotic Englishman and fell for a deception the same way people around Reagan fell for the deception, and they forced Reagan to embrace Gorbachev, and that was one of the biggest intelligence failures in the history of the world, because that fake collapse of the Soviet Union, the fake defeat of communism, we had the Russian collusion hoax, we had the defeat of communism hoax. That put our side to sleep. As the enemy wrote before that, we're going to put them to sleep, big peace movement, then we're going to crush them with our clenched fist. Now they got the fist clenched. It's not coming down on us yet, but it's there. Ukraine now kind of disrupted that a bit because Ukraine is fighting for their lives. They knew the last time the Russians came in, the communists in Ukraine murdered from 6 to 7 to 10 million Ukrainians through confiscating the food, the grain, the farm animals, the seeds, the crops, and the farm implements. And when that happened, people marching through the streets of New York begging President Roosevelt for help. As they're marching through the streets begging for help against the genocide in Ukraine, Several points along that march, they got attacked by communists in the streets. The communists that attacked the Ukrainians in the streets are probably the same communists that voted for Mandami, the relatives, the descendants of the same people, because New York was known for having a strong communist movement. I don't want to talk much about this. I don't want to be called anti-Semitic, so I'm going to just leave it at that. Now, let me get back here. What I was really, I go off on tangents here, but there's a reason. There's so many connections to this communist stuff. So here it goes on. Again, this is writing about the publications captured by Israel when they got into Lebanon. The hardware part of Arafat's presentation to Soviet leaders Gromyko and Pomerov was a formal request for modern air defense weapons which would be effective against Israeli aircraft. As other captured PLO documents show, the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact satellites soon commenced training PLO personnel in air defense and supplied more modern equipment. The PLO minutes of the Moscow meeting closed with Gromyko saying, "We think that we march with you on the same path concerning the Middle East," to which Arafat replied, "We have no doubt." Now the next chapter here is assisting the terrorist. Since overrunning PLO strongholds in southern Lebanon, the Israelis have made available many pages of PLO documents incontrovertibly proving that the Soviet Union and its Cuban, Vietnamese, and Warsaw Pact satellites are now directly involved in training, equipping, and advising the PLO terrorists, okay? So the Soviets in 1982 write, "There's no way anyone can unlink the Soviet Union and the socialist countries from the world revolutionary process." Now here you see it in action. So the American Communist Party leader, Gus Hall, who the CIA director voted for, the same CIA director that targeted Trump and MAGA, you see how this communist stuff is all connected. Now, other than these PLO documents captured by Israel when they went into Lebanon, other than that, everything else I'm telling you here is in communist publications. It's all out in the open. Why the American conservatives deny it, I don't know. Maybe because they really believe the hoax that we defeated communism. And now they can't admit they were wrong because they just can't admit they were wrong. Meanwhile, we could lose our lives and lose our country if these people don't speak up. If they can't or won't speak up, they have to be cast aside. I'm talking about the conservative media celebrities. We need a major awakening now. Time is short. We could lose. People don't understand what it would look like if we lose. Well, think of your house burning and your family dying. That's what it'll look like. And our side just can't comprehend the fact that that could happen. We have a strong military. We have a lot of good people. America's still mostly good people, but we have a large part of our population so ignorant and stupid, and many of them now working absolutely openly against America. It's absolutely incredible how this happened. And this could not have happened if we didn't first believe we defeated communism. That put us to sleep, which was a Soviet stated goal. Okay, so let me get back here to assisting the terrorists. So too are the Kremlin's Middle Eastern client states. These are the ones now helping the PLO. Middle Eastern client states, meaning working with the Soviets, including Libya, Algeria, Iraq, and the little-known brutal communist regime in Aden called the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. Other countries documented in these newly captured materials as providing training or arms to the PLO include the People's Republic of China. Okay. There's supposed to be a Russia-China split. Okay? Now, in the Soviet publications, they complained about China broke away and made a big public spectacle of it. So the Soviets basically said China made a big public spectacle of it. Well, the communists wanted to know and believe that there was a split. So they made a big spectacle, a big splash. In other words, everybody saw it and everybody talked about it. China and Russia split. So when the communists admit that, I think they made a mistake, but it doesn't matter because our side is too stupid to see the importance of that. Whether the split was real or not doesn't matter now because it officially ended under Gorbachev in writing in 1986. So here, again, let me repeat this here. Countries working with the Soviet Union, the Cubans, the Vietnamese, and Warsaw Pact satellites are now directly involved in the training, equipping, and advising PLO terrorists. So too are the Kremlin's Middle Eastern client states, including Libya, Algeria, Iraq, and the little-known brutal communist regime at Aden called the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. Other countries documented in these newly captured materials as providing training or arms to the PLO include the People's Republic of China, India, Pakistan, the People's Republic of Bangladesh, North Yemen, Saudi Arabia. A whole consignment of U.S. M16 automatic rifles sent to Saudi Arabia was found in a PLO armory, still unopened and still with the packing label attached. The only Western European country mentioned in the captured documents as willing to give direct military support to the PLO is Austria. Files of the PLO's September Fallen/Cartel Brigade, Castell Brigade, listed training courses open to PLO members in foreign countries. Among them was an Austrian air defense course. Officially neutral, the government Austrian socialist president, Prime Minister Bruno Kreisky, has bent over backwards to accommodate the USSR and the PLO. You see, that's a socialist prime minister. Now, basically, socialism is the economics. Marxism is the philosophy. Communism is the entirety of all of it. So the Soviet Union, they call themselves socialist. They call themselves Marxist, but they're communist. So this confuses people because theoretically you could have democratic socialists, meaning socialist economics without a communist dictatorship. This is what the communists push. Before the so-called collapse of the Soviet Union, Gus Hall, the Soviet agent in charge of the American Communist Party, he was pushing Bill of Rights socialism. That means he's pushing socialism, but not in a dictatorial form. Bill of Rights socialism. And then you have Democratic Socialist of America. Democratic doesn't sound frightening, but democratic and democracy mean rule by the people, and the people are represented by the Communist Party. So the American Communist Party had a split. The breakaway faction, now the split was fake. Communist splits, communist collapses are fake. The Communist Party of America was collapsed twice. Both of them were fake. They did a third partial collapse when they had a split. The breakaway faction of the American Communist Party joined together with the Rainbow Coalition, built by the communists and Jesse Jackson, and other Marxist socialist groups. So the breakaway faction got together with the Rainbow Coalition, various other socialist and Marxist groups. They got together with the Democratic Socialists of America. And then they got into the Democrat Party big time. So just as the Palestinian Communist Party built the PLO, the Lebanese Communist Party built Hezbollah and Hamas, and the Palestinian built the PLO, the American Communist Party penetrated the Democrat Party. Again, Lenin's party of a new type is supposed to go out and penetrate existing groups and parties and movements or build new ones. So they do the same thing. It's like a template in every single country. Now, none of the conservative media celebrities has any clue to this, no clue at all. They might talk here and there about Marx and Marxism. Marx is more the philosophy. Communism is the entirety of all of it. Even people who might be anti-communist, if they're saying we defeated communism, they're part of the communist movement. Even if they're anti-communist, if they're helping the communist movement, they're part of the communist movement. You don't have to be a communist to help the communist movement. The communist right, we have to build communism with non-communist hands. You have rich, filthy rich capitalists who help the communists. Now, I don't think Soros would ever be considered anything but a communist. Anybody who doesn't think Soros is a communist, he's working for communism, he's funding it. He's funding the destruction. He's putting in district attorneys and prosecutors all across the country. So as the communist right, we're still going to have the prosecutors, district attorney, and courts, but they'll have class content. And communists say everything and anything they do that helps communism is moral and just. Okay, so what are these district attorneys doing? What is Soros funding? He's funding prosecutors that go after MAGA, that go after conservatives, that go after the police. They're freeing prisoners. They're freeing murderers. In New York, they freed 47 convicted cop killers were freed from prison because of people put on the parole board by Governor Andy Cuomo. Best way to help the cause of communism, Gus Hall said, was through the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. So Gus Hall said there's no way anyone can unlink the Soviet Union and the socialist countries from the world revolutionary process. That same Gus Hall said the best way to help the cause of communism is through the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. That Gus Hall said he wants to strangle all the congressmen with the guts of the senators. That same Gus Hall is an enemy agent, and yet he was voted for by the guy who headed the CIA and went after MAGA. The communist movement got stronger since they collapsed. That's why they do the collapse. That's why they do the split. And now the remnants of the Soviet-China split are still there, thinking we could wean Russia away from China. I don't think that's possible. And let me get back to these documents here. This is interesting here. Officially neutral, the government Austrian Socialist Prime Minister has bent over backwards to accommodate the USR and the PLO. Let me go down here. This to the extent of providing the PLO with important political support and even agreeing to demands of the PLO's hostage-holding terrorist that a refugee camp for Jewish emigres in transit from the USR to Israel be closed. The Austrian government denied that any training of the terrorists had taken place, but did not repudiate the PLO document showing that training by Austria was available to PLO personnel. Excuse me. The PLO documents were captured in a number of locations. A lot of names here that I'm going to mispronounce. Neptaya, Tyre, Sidon. A major underground weapons depot carved 400 yards into a hillside east of Sidon, and from the files and records of the PLO's September Fallen-Castell Brigade. The personnel files of the latter document training of brigade members in the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, East Germany, and the People's Republic of China. Again, China's involved even though there's supposedly a split. Also, Algeria, Libya, Aden. The discovery of Cuban and Yugoslavian sabotage and terrorism manuals indicates that some PLO members were trained in those countries as well. The documents include official PLO personnel files and orders, private diaries, ordnance shipping labels, graduation certificates for completing training courses, terrorist training manuals, and both official and private photographs of training in Lebanon and abroad. Because the PLO has put together some units in the form of a regular army, some of its supporters and many members, any number of State Department officials are now arguing mistakenly that this proves the PLO is not a terrorist organization, but a guerrilla or national liberation movement. This is false. Now, I disagree with that.
No, hey, Jimmy, just want to let you know you've been at it for an hour and 23 minutes. I'm not going to do a live show tonight, so you're welcome to go as long as you want.
Okay, very good. I'm glad because I just have to say something here. National liberation is key. Now, they disagree that the PLO is a national liberation movement, but national liberation is a communist movement. When you had the Nazis took over parts of Europe, the communists started at that point to work against the Nazis. They were calling it national liberation. So the Soviets worked with us to defeat the Nazis. But before that, remember, I read this in one of my previous presentations here on this channel. The Soviets supported the Nazis and bragged about the Soviet-German friendship in writing. I have the documents. So national liberation. In America, we have liberation movement, black liberation, women's liberation, gay liberation. Whenever the communists take over something, they call it liberation. You have the Christian Marxist unity. It's absolutely amazing what's going on. They're all over the place. So national liberation, everybody has to fight against the oppressor. So when So national. Now the communists are international, but when they're going to take over a country, they come in first as a national group, national liberation, and that's a democratic revolution. Then they turn it into a socialist revolution. So to unite the people against Castro, they had to promote nationalism to get what's the normal inclination of people, is to love your family and your country. So they have to bring up the people's patriotism in Cuba to get rid of the dictatorship that was a puppet of America. In Vietnam, they were fighting against the French. That was national liberation. It was called the National Liberation Front, to liberate Vietnam from the French colonialists. We went in to stop communism, but then to the Vietnamese, the communists portrayed it as we went from one colonial occupier, France, to now America. So under the guise of national liberation, they unite the nation. So they make it a national movement, and then all those national movements come together into the international movement known as communism. The same way the communists work in 70, 80 different groups in America, Puerto Rican, Asian, all the groups I mentioned before. Those are like local parts, and they pull it together to a national part. The same way nationally, the communists work in each country separately, and then they tie it together to the world movement. So they work, it's the same process, different countries and different levels. Let me go on here. Terrorism is not irregular warfare. Legitimate warfare, whether carried out by irregular units or regular forces, strikes at military, not civilians. Deliberate attacks on civilians by military forces is a war crime forbidden under the Geneva Convention. Okay, we have a Geneva Convention, but I read you before what how the communists talk about terrorism. They don't support it if it's going to hurt their influence over the masses that they're building. But in time of war, when they're ready to charge the gates, terrorism is good. That's basically what they say. But then they say, tearing down a system as bad as America, it's so bad that anything we do to topple it is moral and just. So we have laws here. We make laws. Now, when the communists say when they take over, we're still going to have the courts, the justice system, separation of powers, but they'll have class content. So everything is weaponized. So we have the Geneva Convention, which outlaws terrorism. But the communists don't think terrorism is bad. They'll break the laws. Soros is breaking all the laws in this country. So we're going to abide by the Geneva Conventions, and we expect the communists to. Why? Why would we expect the communists to obey any law? They think everything they do that brings communist victory is moral, just. It's going to bring peace, love, harmony, and socialism. This is absolutely incredible here. Now, Larry McDonald, 6 years ago, said, terrorism is a violent attack on a non-combatant segment of the community for the purpose of intimidation to achieve a political or military objective. It is in the action and intent which defines terrorism, not whether the perpetrator is a government, the armed forces of a state, or a group of irregulars. Well, we have definitions. The communists go by what they need. The communists do whatever they have to do to win. We have definitions, we have laws, we have belief systems, we have rules of engagement. You're fighting an enemy, but we set rules before we go to war. The enemy's rule is to win. That's all their rule is. They'll abide by the rules as long as they're benefiting by it. But their agents in our country make us abide by the rules. So their enemy agents make us abide by the rules. At the same time, the enemy does not have to abide by those rules. Okay, now this publication is again from Congressman Larry McDonald, who the Soviets murdered, and this section of this report about the documents captured by Israel. This is titled Propaganda and Reality. The PLO lobby and many of its liberal allies in America are making use of tremendously inflated civilian casualty and refugee figures. The source for many of these is the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, which is headed by Yasser Arafat's brother. Furthermore, the Palestinian Red Crescent Society is an affiliate of the PLO, coordinated by a PLO Executive Committee's Department of Popular Organizations, and has been accused of turning over a large proportion of the contributions it receives to the PLO for arms. So the Palestinian Red Crescent Society is sort of like our Red Cross. It's supposed to be just trying to help the people, the injured, the victims, innocent victims. And meanwhile, it's part of the communist, part of the terrorist movement. Now, the same Red Crescent Society, when you get these reports of the mass murders they claim Israel's doing in Lebanon or in Gaza, and now we hear about Iran, it's the same movement. It's the same operation. It just keeps going and going and going. I don't know what's going to wake the American conservative media people up to this. Have to get this information out to the broader public. Okay, so the report here goes on. Early in June, the Palestinian Red Crescent Society claimed that 600,000 civilians had been driven from their homes in southern Lebanon, a figure used by Arafat in his November 1979 Kremlin meeting, and that there were 3,000 civilian casualties in Sidon. Again, I may be pronouncing that wrong. Within a week, the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva had investigated these charges and stated that there had been 300 civilians wounded in Sidon and that all urgent medical needs were being met. This information was never distributed in the U.S. So the Red Crescent Society, which is part of the World Communist Movement, working with the World Terrorist Movements, working with the Soviets, the Red Cross disputes the 3,000 casualties and says 300 civilians were wounded and they're being treated. But nobody heard the report from the Red Cross. In America, okay, it's an unfortunate and unavoidable fact that all armed conflict produces civilian casualties. These civilian casualties caused by the defenders are easily made to seem the moral responsibility of the attacker. The Israeli drive against the PLO strongholds from which Soviet 130 millimeter artillery and 160 millimeter artillery regularly shelled civilians in Israel falls within the traditional military concept of self-defense. The New York Times has published accounts by reporters traveling to villages in southern Lebanon formerly occupied the PLO, interviewing Lebanese and Palestinian civilians, Muslim and Christians. These accounts have stated flatly that the PLO forces did virtually nothing for the civilians. Indeed, the PLO took the vast sums of money donated by Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries and spent it primarily on weapons and ammunitions, which were placed strategically in densely populated areas in the hope that this would deter Israeli attacks or subject Israel to charges of killing civilians. In this, as has been seen, they were following orders from Moscow given personally to Yasser Arafat by Boris Pomonarov, chief of the International Department of the Soviet Communist Party. This is how the enemy works. I mean, they did this in Vietnam, they did this in Nicaragua, in South Africa. I want people have to look at this. You have to go on the internet and you want to look up necklacing. Necklacing is what happened in South Africa, where they put a tire around somebody and then poured gasoline over that person and set him on fire, him or her. And the person is dying and screaming in the most agonizing pain, and they can't get out. The tires around them, that's like their arms are stuck at their side. They're like melting like a candle. And when they fall down, little kids, little African kids with hatchets and machetes are slicing the person up. It's called necklacing. And somebody who openly supported it said, we're going to use petrol and matches to liberate South Africa. That was said by Willie Mandela, the wife of Nelson Mandela. So Winnie Mandela supported the firing, the bombings, and necklacing. Again, you could look it up. Sometimes they took random people in a crowd. They did this to terrify. This is how the communists work. You kill one, you terrify thousands. The mafia works this way. Gangs work this way. You make an example of somebody, and that deters other people from following. What the Communist Democrat Party is doing to Trump is to deter anybody from speaking up, trying to stop the revolution. You got the Afro-Leninist, Enviro-Leninist, Homo-Leninist, Femi-Leninist, Lesbo-Leninist, Narco-Leninist. Trump is opposing all of that. So the communist movement is united against Trump. And then there's conservatives who don't agree, or that maybe they're rightly pointing out Trump is making. When the conservative movement builds against Trump, then we lose. We have to be very careful. Trump can't be expected to know this stuff. Trump never studied communists. Everything I did, nobody taught me this. I learned on my own by reading the communist publications. In this case, I'm reading a publication from an anti-communist on papers that Israel captured when they went into Lebanon. So the movement is growing here. These accounts have stated flatly that the PLO forces did virtually nothing for the civilians. Okay, we did that. Another unexpected discovery was the presence of hundreds of foreigners fighting in the PLO's ranks. Captured PLO documents show that they were recruiting mercenaries from the Islamic countries, with a large number of these assigned to the September Fallon Castile forces. I think I already read that. The PLO orders that children down to the age of 12 were being conscripted. This forcible conscription of youngsters and youth was enforced by the fact that they were denied an education in the schools of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency because of that group was personnel were also PLO agents. I don't know if I misread that here. Look, the communists work in every group. When they work among Islam, you're going to have terrorism. So in the past, in Muslim history, they were militant, maybe violent, maybe terroristic against their opponents. I'm not going to argue with Muslims about that. But either way, the Soviets find a way to get everybody mobilized, radicalized, politicized. I heard that as a kid in the streets, what the communists were openly saying. What they want to do with American youth, particularly minorities, politicize, radicalize, militarize. The Revolutionary Communist Party openly supports armed revolution. They tell the street thugs, get out of the street, into the revolution. There are better things to fight and die for. Soros is funding that movement to put that literature in the prisons. So they work in the prisons and street gangs. So they're getting people already violent and criminal, and then political and radical. So they're doing it from the other end. Politicized, radicalized, militarized. That's what they did with American youth. When you get blacks coming out all across the country, rioting, burning, and you had white people behind that. There was communists behind that agitating the crowds. This is going on all over. It's in every country. So let me get back to this stuff here. In any event, published interviews with southern Lebanese Muslims indicate a general opinion that the large numbers of Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, Indians, and North Africans were considered thieves, bullies, and brigands by the local residents. Furthermore, the child conscripts were not merely undergoing militarized Boy Scout training, but were learning to fight with standard military weapons. Israeli forces found themselves facing PLO soldiers aged 12 and 13, fighting with rocket-propelled grenade launchers. Some 200 of these youngsters were taken prisoner and later released in the custody of their relatives. When the Soviets got in Afghanistan, they took tens of thousands of Afghani children into the Soviet Union for training. I don't know what happened to them. I don't know if there's any reports or research or study on it, but they're not sending them back to the Soviet Union to teach them how to be farmers and laborers. They're doing something with them. That could have been what came back later on as the Taliban or something. When the Soviets controlled part of Yemen, they took thousands of those children into the Soviet Union. This is how the enemy works. They go after the children. So in America, they go after the children to destroy them, but they also go after the children to convert them to wage war against America. The communists work at every level. They say this: social, cultural, political, economic. That's in their writing, not mine. That's the enemy's writing. Where are the conservatives on this issue in America? They're asleep. They're laughing. TDS, Trump derangement syndrome. When you see the old films, what do they call it? When they had the newsreels in the theaters about World War II, during the war, nobody was laughing. They weren't laughing about what the Nazis were doing. We have conservatives laughing about what they call TDS, Trump derangement syndrome. Like, this is silly, this is crazy. It may be crazy, but that's the enemy. They have enormous power. That movement that murdered up to 150 million people has influence in this country, socially, culturally, politically, economically, among blacks, among Asians, youth, gays, lesbians. This could drive you crazy knowing it. I tell you, at times I wish I didn't know it. Some military analysts say that Okay, it says this chapter now is the escalating involvement. Since the late 1960s, the Palestinian Liberation Organization has been the most glaring example of direct Soviet support for an internationally active terrorist organization. Large-scale open Soviet backing of the PLO dates to the period following the 1967 Six-Day War, when the Soviet Politburo decided to support the PLO terrorists as a national liberation movement, even though many PLO leaders were not then Marxist. But over the past 15 years, hundreds of PLO recruits have undergone indoctrination and training in Soviet Union, Cuba, and East European countries, and by communist instructors in the Arab camps, okay? Communist instructors in the Arab camps, okay? Communist Party of a new type, I said, is in every country, working at all levels. And Gus Hall said you cannot unlink the Soviet Union and the socialist countries from the world revolutionary process. So right here, they're talking about the world revolutionary process led by the Soviets, and they're working, trained by other communist parties, even though some of these PLO were not communists. They're sent to the Soviet Union, and they make them communists. In return for arms, training, and political support, one of the PLO's services to the Soviets has been to provide training to foreign revolutionary terrorists in its camps. The founding of the German, I'm going to screw it up, the RAF, that's like Rote Armee Fraction, better known as the Baader-Meinhof Gang. Okay, the founding of the German, let me get back. In return for arms, training, and political support, one of the PLO's services to the Soviets has been to provide training to foreign revolutionary terrorists in its camps. The founding of the Baader-Meinhof Gang were undergoing training in a PLO camp in Jordan in the Black September of 1970, when King Hussein's forces drove the PLO out of his country. Also in 1970, Venezuelan Marxist-Leninist Iliak Ramirez, who had joined a pro-Cuban faction of the Communist Party of Venezuela while attending Lumumba University in Moscow, arrived in Lebanon to be trained by one of the PLO's Marxist-Leninist factions. The Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, that's the one that's communist. It's not a Muslim terror group. Comrade Iliak was invited to join the PFLP after completing his training, and did so in August 1970. But until the Israeli capture of PLO documents in Lebanon, the major evidence of direct Soviet support for the PLO terrorism had come from statements by PLO leaders, including Zedi Labib Tarzi, the chief PLO representative to the UN. Okay, the UN is always involved in these things. In a 1979 film interview for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation production, The Terrorist Connection, Terzi boasted, the Soviet Union and all the rest of the socialist countries, they give us full support, diplomatic, moral, educational, and also open their military academies to some of our freedom fighters. Terzi's statement was supported by details provided by a former PLO member described training in a Soviet military academy in the Crimea near Simferopol. Again, no one can unlink the Soviet Union and the socialist countries from the world revolutionary process. Here's another instance where this is admitted in communist publications. Adnan Jabbar, a PLO terrorist held prisoner in Israel, gave Western journalists a detailed account in November 1980 of his training. A member of Al-Fatah, the largest PLO group headed by PLO chairman Yasser Arafat, Jabbar and 20 others had traveled to Moscow from Damascus on March 14, 1974 via Arafat. This group was trained for 6 months at a country estate near the town of Skudnaya, some 20 miles outside Moscow, in the use of AK-47 assault rifles, map reading, explosives, etc. Jabal told how in the spring of 1980 He was part of the PLO unit smuggled through Jordan to the West Bank with orders to attack the soldiers and settlers of Hebron. He had set up an ambush of unarmed Israeli civilians leaving Sabbath religious services. All 6 were killed and 16 wounded. Another confirmation that the Soviets were providing terrorist training to the PLO came in February 17, 1981. On that date, the PLO news agency WAFA issued a statement by the PLO's representative in Moscow, Mohammed Shia, boasted that hundreds of PLO officers have graduated from Soviet military academies and that 2,000 Palestinian students were being trained in the Soviet Union. Soviet Support for International Terrorism, the Foundation for Democratic Education, published that a pattern with unsettling implications emerges from the lists of training courses the PLO has been receiving in the Soviet and Soviet-packed, Warsaw Pact military academies. It goes on talking about the SAM-7 surface-to-aircraft missiles, AK-47s, radio operation commando training. This is the world communist movement. They're building armies. Now, in an American Communist Party publication, Political Affairs, Theoretical Journal of the American Communist Party. Remember, American Communist Party is one of the parties that every country has. And it's every country all around the world. The Soviets and now Red China are the leaders of these movements. So in a publication in the American Communist Party, a Soviet writer wrote a book, and the American Communist Party was publicizing and promoting the book. One of the things that they said that the Soviets are doing, this is the Soviet admitting this, they trained 1,500 activists for the African National Congress and several hundred more in vocational training. Now, when a communist country who promotes, supports, and trains terrorists around the world, when they refer to 700 being trained in vocational training, to a communist, that probably means torture, suicide bombing. It's not plumbing and electrical. They're not going to. That's not how the communists work. But 1,500 activists for the African National Congress. Now, the African National Congress, our side said it was not communist. Nelson Mandela was convicted of terrorism. Our country says he was convicted for fighting apartheid. Nelson Mandela admitted to Jesse Jackson, and Jesse Jackson stated publicly on television what Mandela told Jesse Jackson. So Jesse Jackson said that Mandela told him that Mandela was planning bombings all across South Africa. So Mandela got prosecuted and convicted of terrorism. Our media portrays it that he was convicted for fighting against apartheid. Well, he was fighting against apartheid to bring communism. So the communists in Cuba were fighting against fascism to bring communism. So that's how you build the movement. You don't build a movement in a country for communism. You build a movement against the fascist dictator. You build a movement in South Africa against apartheid. But meanwhile, you're doing that under the guise of that, your goal is to bring communism. So President Carter would not buy chromium from South Africa, even though we needed chromium. So Carter would not buy the chromium from South Africa. So then Carter had us buy the chromium from the Soviets. So we didn't buy it from South Africa, but we got the same chromium. We paid 6 times the price, but we didn't buy it from South Africa. We bought it from the Soviets. The guy in charge of the communist revolution in South Africa was Joe Slovo. Joe Slovo was pushing the slogan, "A bullet for Whitey," trying to make a racial war there. Now, at one of the rallies, the youth, the young black African youth, started yelling, "A bullet for Whitey." Then they started yelling, "A bullet for Slovo." And I read that Slovo got frightened by that. Now, Slovo, it's very interesting. Just as when you hear organized crime, like my family's Italian, my last name was Spinelli, okay? We changed it. My name has changed twice. I had to change family name. We had to do it because for the threats I face in my family. So when you hear organized crime, right away, even in me, first thing you think is mafia, you think of Italian. Now, there had been before the Italian crime came here, you had Jewish crime. You had the Irish organized crime. So the same way there's a stereotype about Italians and organized crime, you have stereotypes about other groups. Now, one of the stereotypes about Jews is communism. Eric Brindell, a Jewish man, worked at the New York Post. Eric Brindell was a definitely bona fide anti-communist. He was Jewish, proud Jewish, and that's good for him, rightfully so. A proud Jewish American, but he was also anti-communist. When the questions comes up about Jews and communism, right away people start screaming anti-Semitism. So we have to ignore part of the communist movement because we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. Nobody wants to be called an anti-Semite. Eric Brindell said only a small amount of the Jews are communist, but Jews are overly represented in the communist movement. Because of that, some of the anti-Semitism comes from people who were hurt by communists. The head communist in Ukraine during the murder of up to 10 million Ukrainians was a guy named Kaganovich. He was Jewish. Joe Slovo, that brought communism to South Africa, was Jewish. Borodin and Solomon Adler, Jewish, brought communism to China. So people who are victims of it identify it with, and it's not right, it's just a normal reaction. It's like I knew black cab drivers that tried not to pick up young black guys. Were those black cab drivers racist? No. They were afraid of crime. So when you get hurt by somebody, you tie it to the group. It's not fair, but it's natural. The same way everybody equates organized crime with Italian. People who created communism. And now it's not fair because you have Israel now, which Stalin and the UN helped found the state of Israel to be a socialist model for the backward Arabs. The Arabs were so strongly against what they considered white people coming into their midst, blonde hair, blue-eyed, red-haired people from Europe. So the Arabs saw it as foreigners from Europe being plopped in their midst. So the Soviets gave up backing Israel and started backing the Muslims. So Israel now is under attack by communists, and yet there are communists that support the terrorists. I mean, there are Jews who support the terrorists. New York, we have a guy that became mayor who's got communist backing and radical Islam backing, and he got 1/3 of the Jewish vote. So there's a battle in Israel between the people who don't like Netanyahu. So the battle, you have the Jews that are Zionist, and I'm not an expert at all on Israel or Jews, not at all, and I don't pretend to be. I'm not trying to imply that I am, but I study communism, so I know all the tangents connected to it. When I talk about Antonio Gramsci, an Italian communist, nobody says I'm anti-Italian. When I report that one of the major factories in Italy, the Tagliati factory, is named after an Italian communist, I'm not called anti-Italian. But if I bring up, like, the Institute for Policy Studies, okay, the founders of it, Jamie Raskin's father, Marcus Raskin, is a leader and founder of the tax-exempt KGB front group in Washington, the Institute for Policy Studies. Jamie Raskin is a hardcore, radical, fanatical anti-American. Jamie Raskin, Congressman Raskin, Democrat, actually said, we're going to go after any country that works with and supports Trump. So he's making threats to foreign-friendly countries. The same way Susan Rice the other day, Democrat, worked for Obama. She's threatening that when they're back in power, they could go after everybody in politics and business and the legal system, anybody that worked with Trump or MAGA. So you have the communist movement going after countries who support America. You have the communist movement going after people who are in the way of the communist movement by supporting MAGA. This is the enemy operation. So you have the Zionists, which are basically, I would guess, they're more like nationalists, and the communists equate nationalism with fascism. So the people that work against nationalism are usually the communists. So it's, I believe, more than a third of, I think it was 37% of the Jewish vote that went for Mandami. That's the same Jews that wouldn't be supporting Israel. That's the same group that wouldn't support Oliver North when he was trying to stop the communists in Nicaragua. Remember, Oliver North tried to stop the communist takeover of Nicaragua, and he tried to find a moderate faction in Iran. No, he failed at both. There was probably no moderate faction because the communist movement is what toppled the Shah. That was a Soviet operation. But the Democrats here, whether meaning to or not, were working with the communist movement. They stopped us from keeping Nicaragua democratic. So basically, by doing that, they helped the communists take over of Nicaragua. Now Nicaragua is part of the world communist movement against us. They're heavily involved in the drug trade and terrorism. And that could not have happened with Nicaragua if we first didn't Castro take over Cuba. So the communists work, it's a process. Everything, everywhere they work, they call it a process. And if I don't support people who complained about the Rosenberg spy ring, sometimes they were called anti-Semitic. I don't believe that if you disagree with anybody Jewish on any topic, anything, anywhere, it doesn't automatically make you anti-Semitic. You have Jewish groups who support the PLO. You have Jewish groups out in the street rioting against Israel. So Israel is attacked by enemy within and enemy without, just as America is attacked from inside, the enemy within and the enemy without. The enemy of Israel, the enemy of America is the same enemy. It's the communist movement. Ukraine is fighting that part of the communist movement in their area. It's a world communist movement. We have people here who support Putin. Michael Savage, an American so-called conservative, supports Putin. So Michael Savage supports the mass murder going on in Ukraine, the destruction of the churches. Mike Savage is an idiot. He might be a traitor, I'm not saying that, but at minimum, Mike Savage is an idiot. Mike Savage, on his TV show, interviewed an author of a book writing about the danger of pornography in America, particularly to the youth. So Mike Savage asked that author, is there a pornography problem in Ukraine? No. Is there a pornography problem in Russia, being that Putin is a devout Christian? Mike Savage says Putin is a devout Christian. He destroyed over 600 churches in Ukraine. Now, when Tucker Carlson and these people complain about Ukraine and the Ukrainian leadership, about the Russian church, the Russian Orthodox Church is a KGB church. The Institute for Policy Studies works at Riverside Church in uptown New York, like Harlem. These churches were penetrated by communists. The Russian Orthodox Church is a KGB church. The Russian Mafia is the KGB Mafia. All of these things going wrong around the world were either started by or helped by communists, either by weakening the defense, or in America, Soros is weakening our system. He's promoting judges. He's promoting prosecutors, district attorneys that are working to tear us down. Remember, the communist right, socially, culturally. What was that?
Quiet. Never mind.
Okay. When the communist right, they're going to destroy us socially, culturally, politically, economically. Then you see Soros comes along, fabulously wealthy somehow. I guess when you have KGB connections, you have inside information, you know where to invest money and make money. And then that money is used to destroy us. So that's using capitalism to build communism. They're using the capitalist system to destroy the capitalist system. What's his name? Bill Kunstler, famous attorney, helping communism, helping criminals. Bill Kunstler, I believe, was an enemy agent. He said, we're going to use the system to destroy the system. That's every system. The political system, the social, cultural, economic system, using the judicial system. When the communists write, the American Communist Party writes, when we're in power, we're still going to have the justice system, the separation of powers, we're going to have everything the same, except they'll have class content. So you got district attorneys that campaign in an election on getting in and defeating and going after Trump. We had an attorney in New York who was representing illegal aliens. There was one particular case that was promoted in that communist newspaper, The Independent, that's INDY, Pendant. That paper is a front for the Democratic Socialists of America, the Communist Party, and the Democratic Party. It's clear when you read the paper. I get it all the time. That paper was promoting an attorney who is defending a man from Haiti. So this illegal alien from Haiti comes in here, and he sells drugs to the youth in America. So this guy comes from Haiti, illegal alien from Haiti, is in America, in New York, selling heroin to the youth in America. He gets caught and convicted. He got 10 years. After his 10 years was served, we should deport him. But that attorney is claiming he paid his dues. He served his time in prison. He paid his dues. They were fighting to keep him here, even though he was selling heroin to our kids. Well, that attorney defending this drug dealer killing American kids, that attorney now is a judge in immigration cases. So that enemy agent attorney is now a judge handling immigration cases. The enemy has penetrated our society socially, culturally, politically, economically. They're in our Congress, they're in our Senate, they had a couple of presidents on their side. They've appointed bad people. A person who is a senior fellow at the tax-exempt KGB Front Group Institute for Policy Studies, Frances Fox Piven. She's famous decades ago. The Pivens, her and her, the Clarence Piven's thesis, something like that, about destroying the welfare system by putting everybody on the welfare system, collecting benefits. The more people you put on the system, it collapses the economic system, and that'll force defense budget cuts. That'll force defense budget cuts. So that person said, Frances Fox Piven said at a communist meeting I was at, we're going to get the changes we want, largely through minorities and immigration. The enemy is fighting on all levels, and our side is laughing, Trump derangement syndrome. Our side is saying, still praising Trump for collapsing communism. If we don't wake people up, and now with the military buildup, with the buildup that's going on across the border around NATO, with the Soviet buildup, as they did in the past, all these different countries working together, training terrorists. Those communist parties in all those countries are still there. So when the communists now run for election and they lose, they step down. So it doesn't look like they're frightening. They step down, but they're still there, building and building and building. Eventually, when they win an election, they're not going to leave. But maybe they're not at that point yet worldwide, but they're very close to it. The Communist Party in America is extremely strong, working through the Democrat Party, but it's also through the culture, through every facet of our society. And when I read stuff from the communist press, I'm not making it up. Now, I read something, I may give my analysis or a little bit of interpretation. But if this were a courtroom, there's no way the communists could rebut this. What the communists would say, well, America was bad. Of course, America. I'm not saying America didn't have problems in the past. Every country did. Every country went through phases. Before you had the British, French, and German colonialists and imperialists all over the world. You had China conquering countries to have an empire. You had the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire. The Indians killed each other. You had one tribe wiping out another tribe. There were always revolutions. There were always wars. And now people don't celebrate Columbus Day. They celebrate Indigenous People Day. So basically celebrating Indigenous People Day. People think until the white man came here, this was the Garden of Eden. Everybody lived peacefully, harmoniously. That's ridiculous. That's racist to assume that. In the Western Hemisphere, you had different indigenous peoples. Normally now we call them Indians, but the indigenous peoples, they were warriors, they were slave owners, and they were cannibals. And this is what the left is now celebrating in America, as opposed to Columbus coming here. We have to wake up, people. And now you got this huge military buildup. You got hypersonic missiles China developed. Russia has them. And they're working with Iran. They were building a nuclear problem in Iran. Originally, they were working to build chemical, biological, nuclear weaponry in Iran, Iraq, Syria, Libya. Some of that stuff got stopped. We went into Iraq, 700 Russian trucks, 700 big tractor-trailer trucks were leaving the country, probably taken out the weapons. So it looks like we went into Iraq wrongfully. I don't know. I don't know who to trust. We can't trust any of the media. We trust what we know. Now, I read the enemy's publications, so I'm not making stuff up when I talk about the enemy. I was among them. I had friends among them. I spent a lot of time among them. They trusted me. I had access. I have their training manuals. At one time, we had the House Committees on Un-American Activities. They did great work. Whenever they quoted Soviet publications, I have the publications to prove it. The Soviets tried to kill John Wayne, the actor, because he was promoting anti-communism. You're not allowed to be an anti-communist. You could be a communist with no problem. You're not allowed to get in the communist way. They call you a fascist, a racist, an anti-Semite, a homophobe. The move is massive, and now it's a massive military. Weapons build up. They have terrorists. They're able to riot in America across every city. They have the ability. They have sharpshooters, assassins, suicide bombers. They probably have demolition teams here already trained in specific targets. They probably have each bridge and tunnel targeted with expert people trained in demolition. What the enemy writes about, we have to training increases strength tenfold, 100-fold, 1,000-fold. Now, the one thing better on our side, we allegedly have better technology and better science. I hope that's true. But when we let Soviet and Chinese scientists into our laboratories, into our universities, we're helping the enemy build up better. Now, we know China does good electronics. The TVs and stuff they produce, I think, so far seem pretty good. We can't keep relying on we have a technological edge. Because even if we have technological edge, their science is in strategy and tactics, in brainwashing and in revolution. So they get the technology from us, but they're way ahead of us in strategy and tactics, in subversion and perversion. Their countries are not falling apart with transgender movements. They're not mutilating their children's genitals. Their children are not suffering from drugs, at least not as bad as we are. The enemy is fighting on all fronts, social, cultural, political, economic. Everything is moral and just if it brings the revolution to victory. They write that. I read it to you. I read straight from the enemy's publications, both Soviet and American Communist Party. Now our government is starting to look at and investigate the Russian collusion hoax. Everybody hearing this, look at the videos from Diana West on her book, The Red Thread. Buy the book. If I had the money, I'd buy a bunch of books and get them to all the Republicans. I would get them to the people in the Trump family. They have to see the Russian collusion hoax was a communist operation. They were working with Russia, not us. They were working with Russia. Russia has influence in the American Communist Party. They have influence all throughout here. They have different front groups, different operations under different guises. I told you, I read the 47 communist parties send congratulations to the American Communist Party. Since we defeated communism, isn't it interesting how there's more communists now in America than before? There's more communist parties in the world now than before, and there's more communist influence now than before. So we defeated communism, but we didn't. The China-Soviet split was a split, but it wasn't. They split the American Communist Party a couple of times, but they didn't. They changed the name of the Communist Youth League to 4 or 5 different names. The KGB had 4 or 5 different acronyms, but it's still the KGB. 9/11 Trade Center attack. The mentor and advisor to Osama bin Laden was a known communist, a Soviet agent named Ayman al-Zawahiri. 9/11 is also the birthday of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the guy that did the first fake Soviet collapse. And Felix Dzerzhinsky founded what we know as the KGB. April 22nd, Earth Day, is Lenin's birthday. That's Earth Day. So they got us destroying our energy sector to save the planet, and we send our factories to China, and we buy solar panels and windmills from China and foreign countries. So you see the impact the communists have. Earth Day, 9/11, and October 7, the attack in Israel, that was Putin's birthday. It's a world communist movement. It's the Soviet hand in the Muslim glove. Gotta wake up. It's communism. Quit saying Marx. It's communism. They are winning on many levels. We have a better military. We have great soldiers. But all war is not military, and it's not all soldiers. It's tactics, it's strategy. They have so many people in our government to shape opinion. Now, we hear the word spy. Spy is usually a person who steals information. In the Soviets, China, all the enemy has spies here. More dangerous than spies is agents of influence. They shape policy. They shape beliefs. They shape how we vote. So an agent of influence in America is our media, our culture. It's our schools and universities. It's the unions. It's in the religion, shaping views and opinions. It shapes how we think. It shapes what we know or think we know. So we think we defeated communism, and we didn't. And we think we're voting freely and fairly, but you're not, because your opinions are shaped largely by the enemy. So you're voting freely and fairly according to information put in your head. This is how we don't have free and fair elections. Now, we know they cheat. Everything and anything that helps the communist movement is moral, it's just, it brings peace, harmony, love, and socialism. So cheating in elections, the Democrats don't want identification to vote. Obviously, they know that they could lose elections if they can't cheat. I believe the election was stolen. I believe a lot of elections were stolen. There's more proof now. 300 people able to vote that are dead or not legally. I mean, this is incredible. 300,000 in one state. I don't want to say which one because I'm not sure I have it right. And they're afraid. The Democrats don't want this to be investigated. They don't want any investigation. Why not allow an investigation? Why not have a real investigation? And if you're right, there's no cheating, that'll come out in the investigation. They fear the investigation because they don't want to be exposed. This coming election is crucial. We have to be very careful to not let the Democrats get in. It looks like there's no moderate Democrats. Maybe Fetterman, maybe there's a few moderate Democrats, but they're afraid to speak up because they don't want to lose their seat. We are losing. We are in bad shape. We could lose our country through elections. That's what happened in Czechoslovakia. And that's what the communists say the goal is here. That's what the most important effect that Anatoly Golitsyn said. Through a series of reforms and through parliamentary means, the communists are going to take over. The communists themselves write that. So when Golitsyn wrote that, people didn't embrace him. Bill Buckley, the so-called conservative, didn't embrace him. People worked to discredit Golitsyn. He warned us that we didn't win the Cold War. Beforehand, he warned that they may even open the Berlin Wall. He warned it all that it's a plan. Now, that plan is actually in writing in the communist publications. The possibility of peaceful transition to socialism through parliamentary means. They get control of the means of education, the means of communication, the means of information. Once they get that, ultimately they get control of the means of production, which is basic Marxism. Basic Marxism, and yet very few people understand it. Even people who write about Marxism don't understand basic Marxism. So now we're on the edge here of perhaps the final showdown. The enemy said they're going to put us to sleep and then crush us with their clenched fists. So we've been sleeping since Gorbachev, and now Ukraine is fighting back, and they're not getting the full support they deserve. I think we have to pray, but I don't think God's hand's going to come out of the sky, but we need a miracle. We need a massive awakening. Hopefully we have a total military technological superiority. I'm not sure we do totally, but we are really on the edge now. I think a big war is coming. We have the America's 250th anniversary coming up. I think the enemy's going to have big operations. It's, I really, sometimes I really believe or hope or think I would have been better off not knowing this stuff. Would have been a lot easier living not knowing this stuff. And the fact that I spent 42 years or so talking about this, and I felt like I was the only one until I met, of course, Jeff and Trevor Loud and Jeff Nyquist. Need a major wake-up. So everybody come to this channel. Come to rumble.com, KLW News. I'm Jimmy from Brooklyn. You can look me up. You see me on Mark Levin's show, on Mike Savage's show, Giuliani. I've been on his show a lot as a caller. I did 20 or so interviews with jrnyquist.blog. I did interviews with Bill Jasper. I did interviews with Christian Gomez. I work very closely with Bill Jasper. He's a good anti-communist. He's one of the leaders of the John Birch Society now. I totally support Ukraine. I support Israel. And I support America, my country. I mean, my family, my country. What more? What more do you need to wake up? You're fighting for your family and your country. Look at the little kids running down the street playing. Look how happy they are. And look what could be coming here. A disaster could be coming. Wake up, people. Lee Wilbarger here is doing a great job. Everything he's doing on his platforms. Johnny Anderson in Germany, that's Dynamic Independence. I do interviews there. Trevor Loudon left his homeland of New Zealand to come to America. Trevor Loudon has several books out, Security Risk Senators, The Enemy Within. He has a lot of films, a lot of documentary. Trevor Loudon, you could pick up one of Trevor Loudon's books, just randomly. Close your eyes and put your finger in the book. Whatever page you go to, you're going to find something interesting. I did it the other day, and I found that guy, Van Hollen. It was a congressman or a senator, the guy that's fighting to keep that illegal alien here. Van Hollen works in a lot of communist operations. You have a congressman in New York, Dan Goldman. He now has an advertisement where he's got a reverend, a guy in a black, like looks like a priest, but he's a reverend, a Hispanic guy, maybe Puerto Rican with an accent. And he's promoting Dan Goldman as helping immigration. He's paying a Christian, promoting breaking American law. That doesn't sound Christian to me. Now, the Christian priest, or he's not a priest, he's a reverend. So he's dressed in all black except for the white collar like a priest would wear. He has an accent. And to him, I guess he's fighting for the poor people, the immigrants, the illegal aliens, poor people. Maybe they're Christians, good Christian. But for a religious leader to promote breaking the law is not good. And for that dirtbag, that's the cleanest word I could use here, that dirtbag Congressman Dan Goldman working to destroy the country, and he's paying a Christian Hispanic. This is disgusting. He's exploiting a Christian religion, a Hispanic man. He's exploiting that guy for the revolution. Remember, the communists say meaning the communists are going to get the changes they want largely through minorities and immigration. This whole immigration invasion is part of the communist movement. And here you have a Christian reverend supporting it, maybe not seeing it as a revolution, but Dan Goldman supporting it. Dan Goldman, people like this are enemy agents. They're worse than spies. They are worse than spies. They shape views and opinions, and this is how we got in this mess. And the conservative media people, the conservative politicians, they missed the whole thing, and now they're shocked, and they're still laughing about it, even though we're on the verge here of a major shooting war. We could lose millions and millions and millions of American lives and lose our country forever. That could happen. I know it's hard to believe, but that could happen. We've been warned about it. Plenty of people for years before me. J. Edgar Hoover was warning about it. He tried to stop it. The left destroyed him, his reputation. Senator McCarthy tried to stop it. He was proven right, and his reputation was destroyed. And there are still people, even among conservatives, there are people who denounce J. Edgar Hoover and Joe McCarthy. These are conservatives who have no clue, and they have the big microphone. We have to get on the big microphones. We have to get our word out. It could be too late. I hate to think that, but it's possible. So I thank you, Lee, for setting me up here, and hopefully I'll start being able. I still have my stuff. Is most of my good publications I still don't have access to. They're divided up in 3 different places. Everything was packed, and I put them in 3 different places. The stuff I have handy is just a small amount of the enormous amount of documents I have. All Soviet and American communist stuff. Very important stuff. I divided it up in case something happens to me. I have it in 3 different places.
There you go. All right. Well, I want to thank you for being here. Thank you for coming on. You're welcome to be here anytime. As always, just give me a call, and we'll do our best to get you on as quickly as possible.
We'll do that. People that heard me, spread the word, play it back, listen, listen, listen. You got to get this in your head. It's got to be a permanent tattoo on your brain. We got to get this out there to teach your friends, your family. You're doing it for your wife, your children, your country. Get the word out. Get more people to look at all Lee's great work here. Johnny Anderson in Germany, Trevor Loudon in America, Bill Jasper. Got to get this information out. The Red Thread by Diana West, the Russian collusion hoax, all of it was a communist operation. She proves it. She documents it. You see her interviews. Diana West, buy the book, The Red Thread. Get your congressman, senator, your pastor, spread the word. We got to get this awakening. It's really, really important. Anyway, thank you, everybody. God bless.
All right.
God bless America. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. Have a great night.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye. All right. Also, folks, I'm not going to be doing a live show tonight. I have had issues with my back. I am hopefully now moving towards healing. That has just happened here in the last 24 hours. Prior to that, it was not fun at all. It's still not fun now, but anyway, hopefully I should be back on my feet within the next 11 days. So that's the plan anyway. We are going to be doing Freaky Fridays, and the link is at the top of the chat. Racer's already got that set up. So thanks for being here. Hope to see you on Freaky Fridays, and hopefully I'll be feeling better on Monday. Have a great weekend, everybody.
That's all, folks.